Good day, spiritual artists. This is CJ Miller, your host, and we are furthering along on our journey through the spiritual artist we are designed to create. This is chapter 4, Creating Sacred Space. I look forward to sharing these ideas with you and you doodling along. Okay, quote, the experience of sacred space makes possible the founding of the world, where the sacred manifests itself in space. The real unveils itself. The world comes into existence. Mircea Eliade, Chapter 4, Creating Sacred Space. I previously mentioned that my morning ritual usually consists of a cup of coffee, sitting before the window in my kitchen and listening to the silence. I love to watch the blue jays sweep down on the bird feeder outside my window to gather the peanuts that I set out for them. In that silent space, I ground myself and begin the creative process, whether writing a chapter of my book or completing a painting. However, the current COVID crisis has changed many of my routines. Our home is now also my husband's office, and I can hear him listening to a rather loud news program. My son will be up shortly and shooting hoops or noticeably moving about the house. This morning, I'm finding it challenging to practice getting into the state of a spiritual artist. One of the first steps I learned in becoming a spiritual artist is recognizing what it means to create a sacred space for your work. Sacred space is more nuanced than the choice of a lovely studio. Of course, new artists should locate a spacious table or easel in a room with good light. Georgia O'Keeffe wasn't the only artist to seek out Santa Fe for the wide open spaces and quiet solitude. She claimed that a magical power held sway over the hills and valleys of New Mexico. Many artists have been known to seek out the silence and solitude, and I am one of them. But how do I proceed to get myself in the creative state with so much activity floating around me? For now, I've retreated to my studio on the other side of our home. I'm very fortunate to have a small studio, but it will take more than relocating to that room in preparation for my creative work. It will take a shift in my consciousness. In my newly acquired silence, I remember what sacred space means. It's much more than a brightly lit room and high ceilings. Sacred space is a state of consciousness. When I talk about creating a space, I'm referring to the act of freely allowing for your possibilities, the liberty to let yourself explore and take risks in a safe atmosphere of non-judgment. This space is created by shifting your consciousness and thoughts. This sacred space opens room for new possibilities. There's the space around you and the space inside of you. I attribute my understanding of the concept of sacred space to one of my art mentors, Virginia Cobb. Virginia spent her entire life painting after being raised by a mother who encouraged artistic expression. Not only is Virginia an accomplished artist with work in several galleries, but she has spent many years of her life conducting art workshops around the country, and in later years from her home near Cerrillos, New Mexico. For 6 years, I attended one of her week-long workshops every fall. As I began my adventures as an artist, I found myself referring to her for technical advice, but there was something else about her live workshops that compelled me to return year after year. It was her presence. Virginia emanates a warm, loving presence, and her energy fills the studio with grace. In addition to providing a physical studio, she holds a spiritual space with her consciousness. I admit that I became captivated. The bohemian-style studio lined with various art objects, old painting tubes and canvases, the crisp light streaming through the large windows, and the smell of the juniper trees wafting through the screen door enchanted my heart. Each day our class would gather in her home studio, where a coffee mug in one hand and a paintbrush in the other. Virginia would demonstrate techniques called from a lifetime of painting. As she walked around the room, she extended encouragement and praise. She never criticized and only provided input when asked. Around 4 p.m., the class gathered their paintings and entered her living room for review. There, each student lined their work in a row at the front of the room. Then the rest of the class was asked to give input and praise. I admit that I would sometimes grow anxious during these reviews because some of the paintings were far from perfect. Even though many of these students were successful artists in other mediums, abstract expressionism was a new experience for some, and their work was often unbalanced, rough, and garish to my critical artist's eye. I strained to point out the many ways in which their painting wasn't working. Looking back, I pushed myself to be judgmental and look for ways to justify my presence with negative comments. But Virginia permitted only constructive criticism. If a self-important student suddenly became heavy-handed and critical in their comments, our maternal mentor would instantly become fierce and nudge them firmly back in their place. And yes, sometimes I was on the receiving end of her mindfulness. After my first 2 workshops, I decided to analyze her process. Virginia wasn't a demanding instructor who required exacting levels of technique or skill. She didn't urge any of her students toward a particular style or method. She calmly, lovingly presented her knowledge and encouraged us to find our creative way. We were free to pick and choose from her insight. I then realized what Virginia provided me and everyone else. She manifested and held a sacred space for us. She created a centered environment where we could explore our expression without judgment or condemnation. She nurtured a safe place to explore our creative boundaries. Her workshops introduced me to an essential step on the journey of a spiritual artist, understanding the necessity of maintaining a sacred space during the creative process. In an environment such as the sacred space Virginia provided, you will begin uncovering patterns in your work. These patterns or tendencies are unique to you and unlike anyone else. As a spiritual artist, it is your job to maintain that sacred space for yourself. A space sacred is a safe place. It is one without judgment or condemnation, and it starts with your consciousness. I learned to love her for it. While creating a sacred space applies to our physical environment, it also involves the conscious area within ourselves that receives guidance from a creative intelligence. As Virginia protected the studio setting, you are required to protect the environment of your mind. Sacred energy includes love, appreciation, awe, forgiveness, compassion, and acceptance. When you engage in the creative process, you must maintain space for them in your mind. Likewise, you must guard against any negative thoughts, criticism, jealousy, judgment, or anger. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a place for full emotional expression in the act of creating. It's necessary and it's welcome. Learn to ride your emotions. All emotions, both negative and positive, should be accessed in your art. However, negative emotions shouldn't be directed inward. Spiritual artists learn to create a space of acceptance, love, and experimentation when starting a conversation with creative intelligence. It's in those positive emotions that the divine most easily communicates with us. We must maintain our centeredness. There's a second aspect to creating a sacred space, and that is the use of ritual. After years of attending Virginia's classes, I can pinpoint some of those rituals more clearly. We had a definite schedule for arrival and start times. Late afternoons were opportunities for refreshments and sharing. Virginia always greeted us at the door with a cup of coffee in hand. To this day, when I see her in my mind's eye, standing in an old denim shirt and holding a cup of coffee, I reflexively begin entering a sacred space. And it's not just visual memories that can be part of your ritual. Rituals can also include scents. After years of sojourning to Santa Fe, the smell of juniper triggers me into a conscious reflection. Many spiritual traditions include ritual in their practices. Raised in the Catholic faith, I was trained to bless myself with holy water and make the sign of the cross before entering a church. There are many practical reasons for ritual. It signals to our body and mind that we are entering into presence. Whether that ritual includes bowing, kneeling, crossing oneself, or reciting prayers, we train our mind to enter into a particular state of consciousness. Consider adding ritual to your creative routine. Some artists are in the habit of lighting a candle or playing specific music before approaching their workbench. Others practice sitting and performing a 30-minute meditation before beginning their craft. Some artists even have small altars in their workspace. These altars can include candles, photos of loved ones, favorite poems, or previous creative work. There are no rules to what can be an altar, but everything chosen should resonate with positivity. Rituals signal to our mind that it's time to turn off the negative thoughts, resist self-judgment, and tap into this creative intelligence. Sharing my home throughout the entire day with my family during the COVID crisis wasn't easy, but I am thankful that I recognize the importance of maintaining a sacred space through self-awareness and ritual. Virginia is no longer sentinel over my space. No person, place, or thing will provide this for me. It is my priority to hold this space for myself in consciousness as I enter the creative process. Now, as I read this chapter, I remember some of the wonderful points in it. And I want to point out that there's two levels of sacred space. And the obvious one, of course, is a space of non-judgment, open-mindedness, and creativity, a space of love. But there's a second level. You're literally creating a space, a creative space of idea. We'll talk about that later in the book, but you're creating a mental equivalent, an idea of what you want in your mind's eye. You create a space for creativity, for possibility. I know this is a kind of a strange concept, and it's going to be a little new for some of you. But whenever you desire to create something new in your life, you first have to visualize it, see it, and actually create a space for it in your believability. You have to believe that it's possible. So after you create this wonderful space for your studio and make sure that there's ritual included and make sure that it's quiet and safe, also create a space inside of you. Create a space inside of you that lets you believe and know in your wholeness and the possibility of creativity. You don't have to tell it what it's going to be. You could just say, I'm going to do something creative today and let it happen. But you create a space for it to happen. Does that make sense? I hope so. So what I'd like to have you do is, if you can, down in the notes field of this video, write down some of the ways you create a sacred space in your studio, whether it's an altar, a ritual. What do you do? Do you play a certain music? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love for you to share those with other listeners of this podcast. You go and have a great day. Go out there and make sure that you create a sacred space in your life for creativity. Talk to you soon and see you tomorrow. Thanks again for listening to the Spiritual Artist Podcast. Whether you're watching this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or iHeartRadio, make sure you choose the subscribe button so that you will receive updates when new segments are released. Most importantly, be still, listen, and know that you are a spiritual artist.